I'd rather die in this desert than marry him." Clara Brennan's voice cracked as she whispered the words into the endless expanse of sand and stone. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk, now hung torn and dusty around her ankles. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the world into a shimmering furnace of heat that seemed to drain the very life from her bones. 3 days ago she had been trapped in her father's mansion, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains that felt more like prison bars than luxury. 3 days ago Vincent Morrison had smiled that cold, calculating smile and told her exactly what kind of wife he expected her to be: silent, obedient, grateful for his attention. 3 days ago she had realized that death was preferable to a lifetime of submission under his cruel hands. The memory of his fingers gripping her wrist still burned like a brand. "You'll learn to appreciate what I can give you," he had whispered, his breath hot against her ear. The smell of expensive tobacco and whiskey couldn't mask the cruelty underneath. But what she didn't know was that salvation often comes disguised as danger. Her father, Thomas Brennan, had sold her like cattle to settle his gambling debts. "It's a good match," he'd insisted, refusing to meet her eyes. "Blackwood's got money, position. You'll want for nothing. Nothing except freedom, love, respect, everything that actually mattered." The horse beneath her stumbled, exhausted and dehydrated. Isabella had stolen him from Blackwood's stable in the dead of night, along with what little water and food she could carry in her trembling hands. The stable boy had been asleep, and she'd whispered a prayer of gratitude for small mercies. Now both supplies and hope were running dangerously low. "Easy, boy," she murmured, patting the horse's neck with trembling hands that shook from more than just fear. "Just a little further." But where was further? The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of golden sand punctuated by twisted Joshua trees and scattered rocks that offered no shade, no comfort, no promise of relief. No towns dotted the horizon, no roads carved through the wasteland, no signs of life anywhere in this God-forsaken place. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, split like old leather left too long in the sun. Her tongue felt like sandpaper in her mouth, swollen and useless. The wedding dress that had once symbolized her prison now felt like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating in the desert heat. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. Back home in Charleston, she dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond parlor walls and social obligations. Now she was seeing more of the world than she'd ever wanted, and it was trying to kill her. And that was when everything changed. A shadow fell across her path, bringing blessed relief from the burning sun. Isabella looked up, squinting against the brutal glare, and saw him, a man on horseback, silhouetted against the blazing sky like something from a fever dream or an answer to desperate prayer. For a moment she wondered if the heat had finally driven her mad, if her mind was conjuring salvation from nothing but sand and desperation. "Miss?" His voice was deep, cautious, tinged with genuine concern. "You lost?" Isabella tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper that barely qualified as sound. Her throat felt like it was lined with thorns. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, a gesture that spoke of experience with frightened creatures. He was tall, weathered by sun and wind, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world's troubles. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Kind eyes the color of winter sky, eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul without judgment or calculation. "Water," she finally managed, the single word containing all her desperation. Without hesitation he pressed his canteen to her lips. The cool liquid was like salvation itself, and Isabella drank greedily, feeling life flow back into her parched body until he gently pulled it away with practiced care. "Not too much at once," he said softly. "You'll make yourself sick." That's when Isabella truly looked at him. This wasn't Marcus Blackwood's cruel handsomeness or her father's cold calculation. This was something else entirely, rugged features marked by sun and hardship, but kind. Something that made her heart flutter in a way she'd never experienced, even through her exhaustion and fear. "What's a lady doing alone in the desert in a wedding dress?" he asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Isabella's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the desert wind, running away from the wrong man. The stranger studied her face for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition of pain that matched her own, a understanding that ran deeper than words. "Well then," he said, extending his weathered hand with surprising gentleness, "maybe it's time you found the right one." But what she didn't know was that Ethan Cross had been running from his own painful past for 3 long years, and seeing her there in that torn wedding dress stirred something in his heart he thought had died with his wife and daughter. "My name's Ethan Cross," he said, his voice carrying weight of unspoken stories. "And if you're running from something, I know a place where you can be safe." Isabella hesitated. Everything she'd been taught, every rule drilled into her since childhood, told her not to trust strange men in the desert. But something in his eyes, something genuine and protective and utterly different from any man she'd ever known, made her decision for her. "Isabella," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Isabella Hayes." "Well, Miss Isabella," Ethan said, offering his strong arm for support. "Let's get you out of this sun before it kills us both." As Ethan helped her onto his horse, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in months, something that felt dangerously close to hope. His touch was gentle, respectful, completely different from Blackwood's possessive grip. Maybe, just maybe, fate had led her exactly where she needed to be. The horse began moving, carrying them toward distant mountains that promised shade and water. Isabella leaned against Ethan's solid warmth, feeling safer than she had in years. Yet the real surprise was still waiting beyond the horizon, and neither of them knew that Blackwood's men were already following their trail. The sun was setting behind jagged mountains when Ethan's ranch came into view. Isabella had expected something grand, perhaps matching the wealth she'd known all her life. Instead, she found something better. A simple wooden house nestled against Red Canyon walls, with a porch that spoke of quiet evenings and honest work. "It's not much," Ethan said, helping her down from the horse. "But it's safe." Isabella's legs nearly buckled as her feet touched solid ground. 3 days in the desert had drained more strength than she'd realized. Ethan's steady hands caught her, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could smell leather and sage on his shirt. "I think it's perfect," she whispered, meaning every word. But what she didn't know was that this place held ghosts Ethan had been running from for years. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by handmade furniture that spoke of solitary nights and careful craftsmanship. Isabella noticed there were no photographs, no feminine touches, nothing to suggest this place had ever been a home for more than one. "You can have the back room," Ethan said, avoiding her eyes. "I'll sleep on the porch." Isabella wanted to protest, to say she couldn't take his bed, but exhaustion was winning the battle against politeness. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." Ethan nodded curtly and disappeared outside, leaving Isabella alone with questions that multiplied in the gathering darkness. Who was this man who'd saved her life without asking for anything in return? And that was when she noticed the small wooden cross hanging by the window. The bedroom was simple, a quilt-covered bed, a wash basin, a single chair, but it was the woman's nightgown folded carefully in the dresser drawer that made Isabella's heart skip. She held the soft cotton in trembling hands, wondering about the woman who'd once worn it. Outside, she could hear Ethan moving around the barn, tending to the horses with quiet efficiency. The sounds were comforting somehow, proof that she wasn't alone in this vast wilderness. When Isabella emerged from the bedroom later, she found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his weathered features. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Thought you'd be dead to the world by now." Isabella settled into the chair across from him, acutely aware that she was wearing another woman's nightgown. "Too many questions in my head." "Questions are dangerous things," Ethan said, but his tone was gentle. "So is running away in the middle of the night." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two broken people finding unexpected solace in shared solitude. Finally, Isabella gathered the courage to ask what had been eating at her since arrival. "The nightgown," she said quietly. "It belonged to someone special." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My wife, Sarah." The name came out rough. "She died 3 years ago. Fever took her and our little girl both." Isabella's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry." Sarah would have wanted her things to help someone in need. She had a generous heart. But what she didn't know was that seeing Isabella in Sarah's nightgown had stirred emotions Ethan thought he'd buried forever. "Is that why you live out here alone?" Isabella asked. "To escape the memories?" "Memories follow you everywhere," Ethan said, finally meeting her eyes. "But out here at least they're quiet." Isabella understood more than he knew. "My father sold me to Marcus Blackwood like I was property," she said. Not because he cared about my happiness, but because Blackwood promised to cover his gambling debts. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. What kind of man sells his own daughter? The kind who values money more than love. Isabella's voice was bitter. Blackwood made it clear what he expected from a wife. Complete obedience. No questions, no opinions. She shuddered. He said if I tried to run he'd have me declared mentally unstable and locked away. That's why you chose the desert, Ethan said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Better to die free than live as a prisoner. And that was when Ethan made a decision that would change everything. You don't have to keep running, he said quietly. You can stay here, as long as you need. Isabella's breath caught. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Ethan's voice was firm. Nobody should have to choose between freedom and survival. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. Why? She whispered. Why would you help a stranger? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with old pain. Because 3 years ago a stranger helped me bury my wife and daughter when I couldn't even stand up straight from grief. Sometimes we're put in each other's paths for reasons we don't understand until later. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their lonely voices echoing off canyon walls. Isabella shivered, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. What if Blackwood comes looking for me? Then he'll have to go through me first. The quiet conviction in Ethan's voice sent warmth through Isabella's chest. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her instead of control her? But what neither of them knew was that Blackwood's tracking party had made camp less than 10 miles away, and their leader had strict orders to bring Isabella back alive, no matter what it cost. Get some rest, Ethan said, rising from the table. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. As Isabella watched him walk toward the door, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the safety that comes from knowing someone genuinely cares. Ethan, she called softly. He turned back. Thank you for seeing me as a person instead of property. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, walls coming down that he'd built around his heart 3 years ago. Get some sleep, Isabella. You're safe now. But as she finally drifted off in Sarah's bed, wearing Sarah's nightgown, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that their biggest challenges were still ahead. Yet the real test was already riding toward them through the desert night. Isabella woke to the sound of gunshots echoing across the canyon. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she bolted upright in Sarah's bed, the morning sunlight streaming through thin curtains doing nothing to calm her terror. Those weren't hunting shots or casual target practice. Those were the sharp, deliberate cracks of men with deadly intent. Ethan, she called out. But silence answered her. Isabella threw on the simple dress she'd found in the wardrobe, another of Sarah's belongings, and rushed outside. The ranch yard was empty except for chickens pecking at scattered grain. No sign of Ethan anywhere. But what she didn't know was that he was already positioned behind the barn, rifle in hand, watching 3 riders approach from the east. The men wore expensive suits despite the desert heat, their horses fresh and well-fed. These weren't drifters or casual travelers. These were hunters, and Isabella had no doubt who'd sent them. Hello, the house! The leader's voice carried across the yard with practiced authority. We're looking for someone. A young woman. Goes by Isabella Hayes. Isabella's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the kitchen window, watching as Ethan emerged from behind the barn, his rifle held casually but ready. Don't get many visitors out this way, Ethan called back, his voice steady and calm. What's your business with this woman? She's promised to marry Marcus Blackwood, the leader replied. Seems she got cold feet and ran off. We're here to escort her home. That so? Ethan's tone gave away nothing. Well, I haven't seen any runaway brides. Just me and my cattle out here. The leader, a thin man with cruel eyes and a carefully waxed mustache, dismounted slowly. His 2 companions followed suit, their hands never straying far from their weapons. And that was when Isabella realized these men wouldn't leave without searching the house. Mind if we look around? The leader asked. But it wasn't really a question. Mr. Blackwood's offering a generous reward for her safe return. Might be worth your while to cooperate. Ethan shifted his grip on the rifle. I mind plenty. This is private property. Now, friend. The leader's smile was cold as winter wind. No need for unpleasantness. We just want to make sure you're telling the truth. Isabella couldn't let Ethan face this alone. Despite every instinct screaming at her to hide, she stepped out onto the porch. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto her immediately. "Gentlemen," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I believe you're looking for me." The leader's smile widened. "Miss Hayes, what a relief to find you safe and sound." "I'm perfectly safe, thank you," Isabella replied. "And I have no intention of returning to Mr. Blackwood." "I'm afraid that's not up to you, miss. Your father signed a binding contract. You belong to Mr. Blackwood now, legal and proper." The word belong hit Isabella like a physical blow. She'd run hundreds of miles through desert hell to escape that very concept, and here it was following her like a persistent shadow. "A woman doesn't belong to anyone," Ethan said quietly, but his words carried the weight of granite. The leader's attention shifted back to Ethan, and Isabella saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "This your land, friend?" "It is." "Then you understand about property rights." The man's hand drifted toward his gun. "Miss Hayes is Mr. Blackwood's property, same as if she was a prize horse or a piece of jewelry." But what Isabella didn't know was that comparing her to livestock was the worst thing this man could have said to Ethan Cross. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I've buried a wife and daughter in this ground. I know what real loss feels like. And I know the difference between love and ownership." The tension in the yard stretched taut as a wire fence. Isabella could feel violence building in the air like pressure before a thunderstorm. "Ethan," she said softly, stepping closer to him. "It's all right. I'll go with them." "No." A single word came out flat and final. "You won't." The leader's patience was wearing thin. "Look, friend, we don't want trouble, but we're not leaving without the girl." "Then I guess you're not leaving." And that was when everything exploded into chaos. The leader went for his gun first, but Ethan was faster. The rifle cracked like thunder, and the man spun backward, clutching his shoulder. His companions scrambled for cover behind their horses, drawing their own weapons. "Get inside!" Ethan shouted to Isabella. But she was already moving. Bullets whined through the air, splintering wood and sending chickens scattering in panicked squawks. Isabella dove through the kitchen door just as the window above her head exploded in a shower of glass. From inside the house she could hear Ethan methodically returning fire. One shot, pause, another shot, each one measured and deliberate, like he was hunting rather than fighting for their lives. But what she didn't know was that Ethan had fought in the war between the states, and killing men who threatened innocent women wasn't new to him. The gunfight lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the silence finally fell, Isabella wasn't sure if it meant victory or death. She crept to the broken window and peered out. 2 of Blackwood's men lay motionless in the dirt. The leader sat propped against a fence post, still alive but bleeding heavily from his shoulder. Ethan stood over him, rifle pointed at the man's chest. "You tell Blackwood," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "that Isabella Hayes is under my protection now. If he wants her, he'll have to come through me, and I promise you, he won't like how that conversation ends." The wounded man spat blood. "You don't know what you're up against, cowboy. Blackwood's got money, influence, connections. He'll bring the law down on you." "Let him try," Ethan replied. "Out here, I am the law." Isabella watched as Ethan helped the wounded man onto his horse, then slapped the animal's rump to send it galloping east toward civilization. The message was clear. "Go back and tell your master what happened here." When Ethan finally came inside, Isabella was waiting by the kitchen table, her hands shaking with delayed shock. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms, needing the solid comfort of his presence. "Are you hurt?" she whispered against his chest. "No," he murmured, his arms closing around her. "Are you?" "Not physically." Isabella pulled back to look at him. "But Ethan, what have I done? I've brought violence to your peaceful home. Those men are dead because of me." "Those men are dead because they chose to threaten an innocent woman," Ethan corrected firmly. "That's on them, not you." But what Isabella didn't know was that holding her like this, feeling her heart beat against his chest, was awakening feelings Ethan thought had died with Sarah. "He won't stop," Isabella said, stepping reluctantly out of Ethan's embrace. "Blackwood won't let this go. He'll send more men or bring the sheriff, or—" "Then we'll deal with whatever comes," Ethan interrupted. "But I meant what I said out there. You're under my protection now." Isabella looked into his winter blue eyes and saw something that made her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about duty or kindness anymore. Something deeper was growing between them, something that both thrilled and terrified her. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because you're not a stranger anymore. And because, he paused, seeming to wage an internal battle. Because Sarah would have wanted me to fight for love, not just survive without it. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Ethan," she whispered. He reached out, his calloused fingers gentle as they traced her cheek. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still scared and running and—" Isabella silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, full of questions neither of them was ready to answer. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. "Not from Blackwood, not from this, not from you." But what neither of them knew was that the wounded man had made it to town, and by sunset a much larger force would be riding toward the ranch led by Marcus Blackwood himself. Yet for now, in this moment, Isabella felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt chosen rather than owned, protected rather than controlled, loved rather than possessed. And for the first time in her life, she was willing to fight for that feeling. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon just as the sun reached its peak, a dark smudge against the blazing sky that meant only one thing: Marcus Blackwood was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. Isabella stood on the porch beside Ethan, her hand shading her eyes as she counted the riders. "How many do you think?" "Too many," Ethan replied grimly, checking his rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. "Maybe 15-20 men." Isabella's heart sank. Yesterday's gunfight had been 3 against 1, and that had been deadly enough. This was an army. "There's still time," she said quietly. "I could ride out and meet them, surrender myself before." "No." Ethan's voice was iron. "We've been through this." But what Isabella didn't know was that Ethan had spent the night preparing for exactly this moment, and he had no intention of letting Blackwood take her without the fight of his life. The riders came closer, and Isabella could make out the man leading them. Even at a distance, Marcus Blackwood's arrogance was unmistakable, the way he sat his horse like he owned the world, the expensive clothes that somehow stayed pristine despite the desert dust, the cold calculation in every movement. Behind him rode what looked like half the hired guns in 3 counties, men with dead eyes and quick hands, the kind who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. "Isabella Hayes," Blackwood's voice carried across the canyon, cultured and commanding. "I've come to take you home." Isabella stepped forward, every fiber of her being rebelling against showing fear. "I am home, Marcus. I won't go with you." Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "My dear girl, you seem to be confused about your circumstances." He gestured to the men surrounding him. "You have 2 choices. Come with me willingly and resume your place as my intended bride, or watch your protector die slowly while you're dragged away regardless." Ethan raised his rifle. "You're trespassing, Blackwood. Turn around and ride away." "I don't think so." Blackwood's smile was cold as January frost. "You killed 2 of my men, Mr. Cross. That makes you a murderer. Sheriff Morrison is riding with us today." He gestured to a heavy-set man with a badge. "Everything we're about to do here is perfectly legal." And that was when Isabella realized Blackwood had bought himself a corrupt sheriff. The sheriff spurred his horse forward. "Ethan Cross, you're under arrest for the murder of Jake Williams and Tom Brady. Drop your weapon and surrender yourself for trial." "Those men drew first," Ethan replied evenly. "I was defending my property and my guest." "That's not how Mr. Blackwood tells it," the sheriff said with a practiced smirk. "And he's got witnesses." Isabella watched in horror as 3 of Blackwood's men nodded solemnly, prepared to swear to whatever version of events their employer required. Justice, it seemed, was another thing money could buy. "So here's how this works," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man explaining simple facts to a child. "You surrender to the sheriff, stand trial for murder, where you'll undoubtedly hang, and Miss Hayes comes home to fulfill her obligations. Everyone wins." "Except for justice," Ethan said quietly. "Justice is a luxury for those who can afford it," Blackwood replied with a shrug. "You, Mr. Cross, apparently cannot." But what Blackwood didn't know was that Isabella Hayes had spent 3 days in the desert learning exactly how much she was willing to sacrifice for freedom. "Wait," Isabella called out, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "I have a proposition." Blackwood's eyebrows rose with interest. "Oh, do tell." Isabella stepped away from Ethan, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. A contest. Single combat. Your best man against Ethan. Winner takes all. Isabella, no, Ethan whispered, but she pressed on. If your man wins, I'll come with you willingly and marry you without protest. But if Ethan wins, you ride away and never bother us again. Blackwood considered this, his cold eyes calculating. Interesting. But what makes you think I'd agree to such theatrical nonsense? Because you're a gambling man, Isabella replied, remembering her father's stories about Blackwood's legendary poker games. And because deep down you know that taking me by force will never give you what you really want, my willing submission, win me fairly, and you'll have that. Take me as a prisoner, and you'll spend every day wondering if I'm planning to poison your coffee. The threat wasn't idle, and they both knew it. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes moving between Isabella and Ethan. Finally he smiled, an expression more unsettling than his anger had been. Very well, but I choose the terms. Knives, not guns. First blood doesn't count. Fight to the death. Isabella's stomach dropped. She'd hoped for a fist fight, something where Ethan's size and strength would give him an advantage. Knives were unpredictable, deadly, final. Agreed, Ethan said before Isabella could object. Blackwood gestured to one of his men, a lean, scarred individual who moved like a snake. Valdez here has never lost a knife fight. Killed 17 men in fair combat from what I understand. Valdez smiled, revealing gold teeth, and drew a wicked-looking blade from his boot. The steel gleamed in the afternoon sun, sharp enough to shave with. And that was when Isabella realized she might have just orchestrated Ethan's death. The two men faced each other in the space between the house and Blackwood's mounted army. Ethan drew his own knife, a simple working blade, nothing fancy but clearly well-maintained. Any last words, cowboy? Valdez asked, his accent thick with mockery. Yeah, Ethan replied calmly. You picked the wrong woman to threaten. They circled each other slowly, two predators looking for an opening. Valdez moved with liquid grace, his blade dancing through complex patterns designed to intimidate and confuse. Ethan held his knife low and steady, his movements economical, purposeful. The attack came without warning. Valdez lunged forward, his blade seeking Ethan's throat with viper-quick speed. But Ethan wasn't there anymore. He'd sidestepped at the last instant, his own knife opening a shallow cut along Valdez's ribs. First blood to Ethan, but the fight was far from over. Valdez snarled and pressed his attack, his blade weaving a web of steel that forced Ethan backward. The hired killer was fast, experienced, deadly. But he made one crucial mistake. He assumed Ethan was just another rancher playing at being dangerous. But what Valdez didn't know was that Ethan Cross had learned his knife work from a Cherokee warrior, and patience was as much a weapon as steel. Ethan let Valdez drive him back, seeming to retreat, waiting for the moment when overconfidence would create an opening. It came when Valdez overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust, leaving himself exposed for a split second. Ethan moved like lightning, his blade finding the soft spot beneath Valdez's ribs with surgical precision. The hired killer's eyes went wide with shock, then empty as he crumpled to the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Isabella felt tears of relief streaming down her face as Ethan straightened, blood on his knife but victory in his eyes. He'd done it. Against impossible odds, he'd won. But what she didn't know was that Marcus Blackwood was the kind of man who only honored bargains when they went his way. Well played, Mr. Cross, Blackwood said, his voice carrying a false note of admiration. However, I'm afraid there's been a change in circumstances. The sheriff cleared his throat. I still have a warrant for your arrest, Cross. Murder's murder, contest or no contest. Isabella watched in horror as the trap revealed itself. Blackwood had never intended to honor their agreement. The contest had been a cruel joke, a way to toy with her hope before crushing it. You gave your word, Isabella said, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. My dear girl, Blackwood replied with a cold smile. Surely you don't expect a gentleman to honor a bargain made under duress. Now come along. You've caused quite enough trouble. And that was when something inside Isabella Hayes finally snapped. No, she said quietly. But the word carried across the canyon like thunder. No, I won't go with you. Not today, not ever. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. Blackwood began, but Isabella cut him off. There's always a choice, she shouted, her voice raw with fury and determination. "You can drag my body back to Charleston, but you'll never have my consent, never have my cooperation, never have anything from me but hatred and defiance." She pulled the derringer from her dress pocket, a small gun she'd taken from Ethan's drawer while he'd prepared for the fight. "And if you try to take me, I'll put a bullet in your head and then one in my own. Is my dead body worth your pride, Marcus?" The gun was small, barely bigger than her palm, but it was loaded and pointed directly at Blackwood's chest. Her hand was steady, her resolve absolute. But what Marcus Blackwood didn't understand was that 3 days in the desert had burned away everything soft and compliant in Isabella Hayes, leaving behind something harder than desert stone and twice as dangerous. The moment stretched like a taut wire, everyone frozen in tableau. Isabella, with her gun raised, Ethan slowly moving to stand beside her, despite the rifles trained on him, Blackwood calculating whether she had the courage to pull the trigger. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "Sheriff Morrison, arrest them both. If the woman resists, subdue her by whatever means necessary." The sheriff hesitated. "Mr. Blackwood, if she shoots you, my problems get a lot more complicated." "She won't shoot," Blackwood said with confident arrogance. "She's a Charleston belle, bred to be decorative and obedient. She doesn't have the backbone for violence." Isabella smiled then, an expression that would have chilled the devil himself. "Would you like to test that theory, Marcus?" Yet the real surprise was still coming, because Marcus Blackwood had gravely underestimated what desperation could teach a woman about her own strength. The derringer in Isabella's hand didn't waver. "I said, would you like to test that theory, Marcus?" Marcus Blackwood looked uncertain for the first time. The pampered Charleston belle had vanished, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. "Put the gun down, Isabella. Someone's about to get hurt," she replied calmly. "The only question is who?" But what she didn't know was that her words were carrying to ears that mattered. From the canyon rim above, a voice rang out. "Drop your weapons, all of you." Everyone looked up to see riders silhouetted against the sky, real lawmen with a federal marshal's badge. "Marshal Patterson, U.S. Marshals Service. We've been tracking you, Blackwood." Blackwood's face went white. "Marshal, there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. We have warrants for kidnapping, assault, and corruption." Isabella watched in amazement as federal marshals rode down, weapons trained on Blackwood's men. The balance of power had shifted instantly, and that was when she realized salvation had come from the most unexpected direction. "Your wounded man told quite a story about hunting an innocent woman," Patterson explained. "Folks in town had been waiting for someone to stand up to you." Isabella finally lowered her gun, hands shaking with reaction. Ethan was beside her instantly, his arm around her shoulders. "It's over," he murmured. "You're safe now." As marshals led Blackwood away, he made one last appeal. "Isabella, your father's debts are not my responsibility," she interrupted firmly. "You'll have nothing," Blackwood snarled. "No money, no position." Isabella looked at the simple ranch, at Ethan's weathered face, at the desert that had nearly killed her but taught her what she was capable of. "I'll have everything that matters," she said quietly. When Blackwood disappeared in the dust, Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months she could breathe freely. "What happens now?" she asked Ethan. He searched her face. "Are you planning to go back to Charleston?" Charleston meant comfort in society, but it also meant a world where women were property, where her choices would never be her own. "No," she said firmly. "There's nothing for me there." "Then you'll need somewhere to stay," Ethan said, a small smile playing at his mouth. Isabella's heart skipped. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to marry me," Ethan said simply. "Not for protection, but because I love you and I hope you might love me too." But what Ethan didn't know was that Isabella had been hoping he would ask that very question. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you. Because I do love you, Ethan Cross." When he kissed her, it tasted like freedom and felt like coming home. 3 months later, Isabella stood in the small church wearing a simple dress she'd sewn herself. When Ethan promised to love and cherish her, she knew she'd found what she'd been searching for. After the ceremony, they returned to the ranch. Isabella had learned to cook and garden to help with cattle. Her hands were rougher now, but she'd never been happier. That evening, sitting on the porch watching sunset, she reflected on her journey. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked. "Giving up your old life?" Isabella thought of her father's mansion, then looked at their simple home, at the man who saw her as an equal partner. Never, she said firmly. A coyote howled in the distance, but instead of sounding lonely, it sounded free. Isabella leaned against Ethan's shoulder. She'd run from a forced marriage and found something infinitely better, a love that was chosen, not imposed. The desert had taught her she was stronger than she'd imagined. Ethan had taught her she was worthy of love exactly as she was. As stars appeared, Isabella closed her eyes and listened to home, Ethan's breathing cattle in the distance, wind through the canyon. She'd escaped from a cage disguised as a mansion and found paradise in a simple ranch house. The woman who'd once been terrified had learned to face down armed men. The girl raised to be decorative had discovered she could be strong. Most importantly, her heart had found its true home in the arms of a man who loved her for exactly who she was. As the desert night settled around them, Isabella Hayes Cross knew that sometimes the best journeys begin with running away from the wrong thing. And in the vast silence of the western night, she finally understood what it meant to be truly alive.